I was sipping burnt break room coffee from a chipped mug that read, "Number One Dad," even though my daughter had outgrown the age where such things were cute. I had no illusions about the coffee, just as I had no illusions about the smirking man waiting in my office. Jeremy Milton, Vice President of Strategic Growth, which really just meant he talked a lot in meetings and added buzzwords to slide decks. He'd beaten me into the building by 5 minutes, already perched in my chair like he owned it. That told me everything I needed to know. When people sit in your seat without asking, it's because they think they don't have to ask anymore, or they think you won't be around long enough to care. "Morning, Tom," he said, leaning back and folding his hands like some dime store Bond villain. He was young, not young enough to be my son, but young enough that I wouldn't be surprised if his dad was still paying off his MBA. His suit was new, tailored, double-vented, dark charcoal. Not the off-the-rack stuff the rest of us wore. His watch caught the light. Rolex. Real or fake, I didn't care. He was trying to project power. That meant he didn't actually have it. "Morning," I said, stepping around him and sitting on the visitor's side. I set my mug down slowly. "What's going on?" He gave a tight smile. "This is hard, so I'll just come out with it. The board's made a decision. Restructuring. Your role's been made redundant." I blinked once. Just once. "Redundant?" "You've been with this company a long time," he went on, "and that dedication doesn't go unnoticed. But things are changing. We're pivoting, evolving. Fresh energy, leaner leadership. You know the drill." I did. I'd given that exact speech 3 times in the last decade. It sounded just as hollow from the other side. My palms were warm, but my chest felt cold, hollowed out like a vacant building. I glanced over his shoulder at the framed photo on the wall. Me shaking hands with Frank Bauer, the founder. Back when the company was 3 floors in a crumbling brick building, and we couldn't afford matching desk chairs. Frank had called me the numbers guy. Said I was the only one who understood where the dollars went after they left his hand. "I see," I said. "There's a severance package. Generous, given your tenure. We'll walk you through it, but it's standard. Legal's already drawn it up. HR will send it to your personal email. We'd like your badge and phone before noon." I didn't nod, didn't move, just studied him. His eyes flicked once to the hallway, like he expected someone to be watching. I almost smiled. He didn't know, didn't even realize. That was the thing about corporate America. Title inflation and empty suits everywhere. He thought chief financial officer meant something symbolic, a figurehead. He thought he'd just fired a number cruncher. He had no idea he'd just fired the one man who knew everything. I took a long sip of coffee. Then I smiled. "Okay," I said. "Let's do this by the book." I handed over my badge and company phone like I was giving up a parking ticket. No drama, no speech, just a nod to the HR rep, Julie, who looked more uncomfortable than I did, and a quiet, "Thanks for everything." That part was true. I meant it. Not for the firing, but for the years before. For the people who'd shown up every day and tried, who hadn't played politics or chased promotions like golden retrievers after tennis balls. I'd worked with some damn good folks over the years. Most of them were long gone. And now I was too. But here's the thing they don't teach you in business school. Firing a CFO is not like firing a marketing director or a middle manager. You don't just cut the cord and walk away. The CFO is the cord. We're the quiet ones who understand where all the bodies are buried, because we signed the paperwork and approved the backhoes. Jeremy, for all his posturing and tailored suits, didn't ask the right questions before he pulled the trigger. And that's what made him dangerous. He was arrogant, but not curious. A man like that thinks he's playing chess when really, he's sitting at a poker table with a hand full of jokers. When I got home, my daughter was still at school, and my wife was at the hospital. She's a nurse, cardiac unit, been doing it for 20 years and somehow still believes in people. I didn't tell her right away, not because I was ashamed, but because I needed time to think, to plan. You don't survive 30 years in corporate finance without learning the art of patience. You watch trends, you track changes, you wait for patterns to emerge, and then you strike. Quietly. I had 3 key things going for me, and they'd forgotten every one of them. First, I still had access to our internal financial reporting system from my personal laptop, a leftover from the pandemic era when the company scrambled to set up remote access and never got around to revoking most of it. They'd shut down my corporate credentials, sure, but I had a secondary login buried deep in the vendor auditing framework, one that didn't show up on standard access logs. I'd created it myself, years ago, when I caught a junior accountant funneling vendor rebates into a shell account. I'd never deleted the access, just in case. Second, I still had copies of our quarterly forecast models, not the polished versions we handed to the board, but the real ones. The ones we built in backroom strategy meetings with Frank, late at night, when revenue dipped and we had to decide who got cut and who didn't. The ones that showed the deals we'd buried, the losses we hid behind creative categorization, the legal settlements disguised as consulting expenses. I knew where the cracks were because I'd helped paint over them. And third? Third was the pension fund. My pension fund. The one Jeremy thought he'd neatly sidestepped by letting me go 4 days before full vesting. But that fund was mine long before his name ever graced an org chart. I'd helped build it, shape its structure, choose the investment vehicles, and I knew, down to the decimal, where the vulnerability lay. They thought they were playing chess. I was the guy who built the board. Narpadavada. I gave it a week, let the dust settle, let them think they'd won. I figured Jeremy had already picked out the new CFO, probably someone from his little circle of sycophants, one of those MBA wunderkinds who think running a company is like playing a sim game. I wasn't interested in titles anymore. I'd had mine. I wore it like armor for 30 years and left it at the door without so much as a dent. No, this wasn't about reclaiming a corner office. This was about something deeper, older. It was about accountability, a word that got tossed around in boardrooms like a beach ball, but rarely meant anything real. I spent that first week compiling files, not copies, originals, things the company had forgotten I had stored away on my private drive, saved during all-night audits and compliance sweeps. I'd always been thorough, not paranoid, just prepared. Over the years, I'd watched CEOs come and go, each one more eager than the last to trim fat without understanding where the real waste lived. Jeremy was just the latest in a long line of short-sighted opportunists. The only difference was he'd made the mistake of thinking I was in his way. One file in particular made me pause. A vendor reconciliation report from 2 years ago, back when we were quietly shifting manufacturing contracts overseas. The board wanted to keep operations domestic-facing in the press, so we funneled the outsourcing through a series of shell firms. Technically legal. Morally, a shade of gray that bled into black. Jeremy had signed off on those agreements when he was still just a regional strategy lead. His signature was all over them, and he'd used them again last quarter, cutting ties with our US-based packaging partner and pushing everything offshore. No disclosure, no audit trail. I had the email chains, the payment authorizations, even the Shell Corporation registration, buried under his college roommate's name. You'd think a man would be more careful. I started small. Sent an anonymous tip to an industry watchdog group. Attached the vendor chain documentation. No names, just the paper trail. Then I reached out to a journalist I knew from my early years, a guy who used to cover mergers and acquisitions before shifting to financial ethics. We met in a diner on the edge of town, over bottomless coffee and stale fries. I slid a flash drive across the table and watched his eyes narrow. He didn't ask where it came from. He knew better. Back home, I cleaned out the garage. A real spring cleaning, the kind you only do when something inside you is shifting. When you feel the air around you tightening, ready to break. I found old company t-shirts, a brass nameplate, a retirement card someone gave me 5 years early. I tossed it all in a box. Didn't burn it. No need for theatrics. I just didn't want the weight of it in my house anymore. I wasn't angry. Not in the way Jeremy expected. I didn't want revenge just to see him squirm. What I wanted was balance. And I was ready to tip the scale. By the start of the second week, the cracks began to show. I watched it all unfold from my living room recliner, the same place I used to sit late at night updating budget forecasts while the rest of the house slept. The news hadn't broken yet, not publicly, but inside the company, word was spreading like a brush fire. My old team, the people who still knew how to read numbers instead of just reciting them in PowerPoints, started asking questions. Quietly, at first, then more loudly. I got a call from Anita, the head of internal audit, on a Tuesday afternoon. She didn't know I'd been fired. Apparently, the announcement had been buried in a strategic leadership realignment memo that no one read past the first bullet. "Tom," she said, cautious, "I'm seeing a few things that aren't adding up. Vendor chain anomalies, off-book entries, unusually fast payments, stuff we'd never green-lighted. Did any of this start while you were still in the chair?" I let the silence stretch before answering. "Anita, I'd checked the last 3 approvals from the Strategy Growth Fund, the Special Allocation Ledger. If Jeremy rerouted those approvals through shell vendors, the timestamps will tell you when the scheme started. You'll know which quarter." She was quiet for a beat. Then, "You didn't hear this from me." "I never do." By Wednesday, the watchdog group I tipped off released a statement, non-specific but damning. "We have received credible evidence of ongoing non-disclosure practices and potential offshore laundering schemes involving a Fortune 500 company in the logistics sector. No names, but it didn't need one. People in the industry talk. Analysts connect dots for sport. By Thursday, our stock dipped 3%. The investor call, scheduled for Friday morning, was already in triage mode. I still had access to the investor line, through a private loop most board members used. Not because they forgot to revoke it, but because they didn't know it existed. It had been set up in the early 2000s, a workaround to bypass the official call filter when high-stakes deals were on the line. Only a few of us ever used it. I logged in anonymously, earbuds in, coffee in hand, just another ghost in the corporate machine. The tone was pure panic. Jeremy tried to steer the call, but the CFO who'd replaced me, some poor kid from procurement with a VP title slapped on him, wasn't prepared. Investors wanted answers about irregular filings, about unreported expenditures, about whistleblowers. He floundered. Jeremy jumped in. Then the board chair stepped in. Then the call ended early. And just like that, the glass tower started to wobble. I wasn't celebrating. Not yet. But I'll admit, I slept better that night. Not out of vindication, but out of relief. Because for the first time in years, the truth wasn't being buried beneath spreadsheets and buzzwords. It was clawing its way out. The following Monday, the story hit Bloomberg. Full headline, full names. Executive corruption probe uncovers fraud at Midwestern logistics giant. They didn't mince words. Offshore accounts, shell vendors, falsified compliance reports, all tied back to strategy growth, all signed under Jeremy Milton's hand. I read it with my coffee like it was the sports page. It wasn't joy I felt, not satisfaction, more like closure, like a door I thought would always stay cracked had finally, firmly shut. I thought about calling Jeremy, thought about leaving him a voicemail that just said, "You should have read the fine print." But I didn't. I didn't need to. His world was already on fire, and the fire was spreading. By noon, half the C-suite had gone dark. Phones off, emails bouncing. The board convened an emergency session. I had a friend still on the inside, Eric, one of the last decent VPs left. He texted me 2 words that told me everything I needed to know. Total collapse. Apparently, the moment the news broke, legal froze all discretionary accounts. Compliance flagged every transaction signed by Jeremy in the last 12 months. Internal audit launched a full review. Employees were pulled into HR meetings without warning. Jeremy didn't even show up that day. Rumor was he tried to delete his company files remotely, but IT cut his access mid-keystroke. If I had to guess, he was already talking to a lawyer by the time his parking badge stopped working. And through all that, no one mentioned me. Not once. That was the part that made me laugh. They thought the chaos was spontaneous, a systems failure, an unfortunate convergence of oversight and bad actors. They still didn't realize someone had planned this, someone who had spent decades learning how to not leave a footprint. The next day, the board chair, Ellen Donnelly, a hardliner with a gray bun and steel in her voice, held a press briefing. I watched it live. She used all the right words. Transparency, accountability, zero tolerance. She announced Jeremy's termination, effective immediately, and named an interim CFO. Then she said something I didn't expect. We will be bringing back former executives in an advisory capacity to help restore integrity and continuity. I almost spilled my coffee. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. Not the old company line, but my personal cell. Unlisted. Unshared. The voice on the other end was careful but direct. Tom, this is Ellen Donnelly. I think we should talk. I didn't say yes. Not right away. I let her sit in the silence for a moment, just long enough to understand that I wasn't eager, that I wasn't desperate, that they had something to prove now. Then I said, I'll think about it. Because I already knew the answer. But I wanted them to sweat a little. Just like I had. They flew me in on a Thursday. First-class ticket. Town car at the curb. My name on a card like I was royalty returning from exile. The building looked the same. That glass tower still caught the morning sun just right. But this time, the shimmer felt artificial. Fragile. Like the reflection of something that used to be solid, but now was just a shell. I walked in through the side entrance, the one only longtime execs knew about. The security guard on duty, Miguel, recognized me immediately and gave a short nod. Respectful. Quiet. Like we were both aware something had shifted. Upstairs, the boardroom was colder than I remembered. Literally. Over-air-conditioned. Probably to keep people uncomfortable. Classic tactic. Ellen stood at the head of the table, flanked by the remaining board members and the interim CEO, a former COO with nervous eyes. They all rose when I entered. I didn't ask them to. I didn't need to. I just took my seat. My seat, the one I sat in for 17 annual budget meetings, and folded my hands. Tom, Ellen began, we owe you an apology. No, I said. You owe the company one. That landed hard, but it needed to. What happened wasn't just a bad hire or a slip in oversight. It was a betrayal of the people who built the place from scratch. The workers in warehouses, the clerks in billing, the drivers on the road who wore our name on their backs while the people at the top sold them out for quarterly optics. I wasn't here to play fixer for a sinking ship. I was here to make sure it stayed afloat the right way, or not at all. They asked me to serve as an advisor, full authority on financial policy, vendor restructuring, compliance overhaul. They even offered to backdate my termination reversal to preserve my pension, as if that would sweeten the deal. I didn't need the pension anymore, not after the exposure, the settlements, and the stock dip. They were bleeding and they knew it. But I agreed, On one condition: full transparency. Internal review teams would report directly to me. Any executive with ties to the shell vendor scheme would be investigated. Publicly. No buried memos. No quiet exits with golden parachutes. Ellen hesitated. "You're asking for a purge." I shook my head. I'm asking for a reset. And that's what we did. The months that followed weren't glamorous. I didn't reclaim my old title. Didn't need to. I worked in a smaller office. No nameplate on the door. I kept my hours short, my meetings efficient, and my promises few. But real. People started smiling again in the halls. Some of the old guard returned. We built new safeguards. We started earning trust again. Slowly. Jeremy? Last I heard, he was under investigation. SEC was sniffing around, and no one wanted to be in his corner anymore. Funny how fast the sharks turn on their own when the blood's in the water. As for me? I walk in through the front door now. No badge, just a wave and a nod. I'm not their boss anymore, but they know exactly who I am, and more importantly, so do I.